The webinar is live, and I believe we are now recording, and we should see our community start to join. Hi, everybody. Welcome. Hello, welcome. I think we still, the platform is still letting some of our community in today, so we'll give a little bit more time for folks to join. We'll start in probably 1 minute, so this is a good time to fill your water bottle if you need to. I know I've got my notebook handy, so if anybody else ready for their note taking, feel free. Welcome. All right, and this is Teaching the 1619 Project, Educators Share. We're so glad that everyone is here, and we will likely have some more folks joining. So no worries for anyone on the call today who is curious about what if I missed something. You will get access to the slides that you'll be seeing, as well as the recording of this session. And throughout this presentation, if you have any questions, you should see a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen where you can add questions. And we've left plenty of time to make sure that we get to as many of your questions as we can. So let's go ahead and get started. My name is Fareed Mostofi, the Associate Director of Education and DEI lead here at the Pulitzer Center. And so excited to support this event today. An exciting conversation moderated by Nikita Stewart, Assistant Editor of the Metro section at the New York Times, also a contributor to the project. Welcome, Nikita. Thank you for being here, and an incredible panel that we've had the privilege of working with or connecting with over the past year and change. Scott Abbott, Director of Social Studies at DC Public Schools, Rebecca Coven, who's teaching English and social studies at Sullivan High School in Chicago, Jason Hall, the acting director for the Office of Culturally and Linguistically Responsible Initiatives at Buffalo Public Schools, Marissa Long, 8th grade social studies educator at Beverly Vista Middle School in Beverly Hills, California, and Christina Sneed, ELA social studies curriculum and instruction lead at University City High School in St. Louis, Missouri. I wish we could all be in person to applaud this community, this group today. So please join me in sending them some silent applause or some good energy. Thank you all for being here. So we'll have a brief introduction and then move right into our panel. You'll see that we have about half of our session set aside for questions. Feel free to start submitting questions whenever you have them, and we'll be tracking those. But I did want to briefly let you know that the organization hosting today's session is the Pulitzer Center. Our mission is to raise awareness of underreported global issues, and we do that through direct support to journalists, staff, and freelance journalists reporting on these issues and in news outlets all over the world. And we also have programs of education and outreach. This is a slide that educators out there, when you get the slides, you can use to share with students what we mean when we say underreported stories. These are essentially issues that just aren't getting enough attention. And what we do is work with journalists who publish in all kinds of publications to make sure they have the funding they need to report these stories and share them. And these are journalist passion projects, issues that are very important. So they range with topics connected to children and youth, people of all genders and orientations, environment and climate change, migration, land rights, conflict. So if you are interested in reporting to use in your classrooms, we encourage you to check out pulitzercenter.org. We also, as part of our education mission to help these stories get out there, but also explore how they can cultivate a more curious, informed, and empathetic and engaged public, our education department has developed programs connecting these news stories and journalists to students and teachers. And here's a glimpse at some of those programs. If you aren't already signed up for our newsletter, please, we encourage you to sign up. And if you would like to connect any of these resources, articles, lesson plans, student contests, virtual journalist visits, workshops to your classroom, please reach out. We were very fortunate to connect with the New York Times Magazine last year to support some initial curricular resources connected to the 1619 project, which we'll be exploring today. These resources are just the beginning of an exploration through this piece had 18 essays, 15 creative works, a 5-episode podcast, photography, primary source documents. And then you'll see our panel has brought in a lot of other resources to explore some really important questions. If you're looking for a place to get started, the link to the curriculum is in the slides here. But also part of what we hope you'll get out of today is hopefully some encouragement to apply to the recently launched 1619 Project Education Network. This is a program that's open to educators and administrators in K through 12 public, charter, independent, alternative schools in the US and US territories. Content specialists and curriculum supervisors working with these schools are welcome to apply, as are educators and administrators working with adults and youth in jails, prisons, or youth detention centers. And what is this application for? What we're trying to do is explore these guiding questions. How can the material that make up the 1619 project support existing curricula while also helping students evaluate historical research and process current events? Also, how can authentic engagement with media literacy skills and news stories, like the stories that make up the 1619 project, help students engage curiously, critically, and empathetically with the world, especially as they explore themes of racial justice? We're asking applicants to let us know how they can do the following: write a standards aligned unit that is directed towards a specific courses, manage the implementation and evaluation of that unit by at least 2 educators. So we're really encouraging teams of applicants for this that include educators, content specialists, administrators, maybe some of the community on our call today could work together to apply. And then committing to share their work so that the work that we're hearing about today from our panelists becomes part of a huge bank of curriculum that we can all draw from, grow from, and learn from. In exchange for all of this work, we are offering $5,000 grants to applicants. So like I said, we're hoping that people will apply in teams, but we do need one primary applicant who will manage the funding. All members of the team that are part of the network will be part of all of the professional development and the convenings that are for sharing knowledge, but we do need a primary applicant. And there will also be access to exciting professional development like we're experiencing today. The deadline for applications is March 15th, and the timeline, which you see on the screen here, is embedded within the application. So hopefully you'll be inspired by today's panel to apply, but if you have other questions about this, you can also add those to the Q&A, and I'll address those at the end. Without further ado, I want to turn it over to our panelists and also let you know that this is the start of a series of exciting events connected to the 1619 project and other important resources. So we have 2 more events this month. Next week, we'll have Nicole Hannah-Jones, who sort of envisioned this project and contributed the first essay to the project, who will be speaking with other contributors from the project as part of an event with the American Federation of Teachers. We'll also hear the following week from Dr. LeGarrette King, who works with the Carter Center at the University of Missouri to explore different methods in all grade levels to teach Black history. And I think at this point, we want to know, we have expertise in the room. How has this community explored the project in their classrooms? So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to our guest moderator, Nikita Stewart, to tell us a little bit more about what we have planned for today, her engagement with the project. And like you, I'm now going to sit back and start generating my questions and adding them to the Q&A. Over to you, Nikita.
Thank you. And thank you for having me. And I am so happy that the Pulitzer Center has embraced the 1619 project and is getting it to so many educators, and that it is getting into classrooms all around the country. In 2019, I sat in a room that Nicole Hannah-Jones had gathered all of these academics and journalists, and we brainstormed on what the 1619 project should look like. And I left there thinking that I was going to write a story about food. And then Nicole and an editor approached me about writing a story about the how enslavement has been taught in American schools through the years. And I knew a little bit about that because I was in school. And I'm from Texas, which had been the textbook capital of the world. And I had something to say besides my education. I wanted to explore my great grandfather because he was a primary source. Years ago, he had been enslaved as a boy, and he was part of the Federal Writers Project. And someone interviewed him about his life as a boy. And so I was able to interpret that in my essay. And so now I'm going to talk to educators today about how they have incorporated the 1619 project in their school districts and in their classrooms. And we will start with a presentation from Scott Abbott, Director of Social Studies for DC Public Schools.
Thank you, Nikita. Well, I'm going to start off, and my position is actually a little different from many of my colleagues. Whereas some others are classroom teachers, my role as Director of Social Studies, I work in the central office for the traditional public school system in Washington, D.C., DC Public Schools. And so I work in the Office of Teaching and Learning, and while I'm no longer in the classroom as I used to be, my role sort of is supporting our teachers and students through various kinds of work. So I wanted to share a little bit of context for Washington, D.C. We are a district of 50,000 students and 117 schools. I work for DC Public Schools, which is a little bit more than half of the public school system within the city. Politically speaking, which I think is relevant for the implementation of this project, we're fairly monolithic, fairly liberal progressive city. And I do think that makes my role a little bit easier than some of my colleagues in other places, and definitely something you want to be thinking about as you implement this project. And then also we have somewhat of a centralized curriculum and teacher professional development system, which I think has led us to do some things that are pretty exciting with 1619 project. In DC, we were really excited when the 1619 project came out because we had already been looking at our curriculum through the lens of social justice. And we had actually just undergone an audit of our social studies curriculum, looking in particular at the ways in which we were representing diverse perspectives, questioning dominant narratives, and decentering whiteness. And so when the 1619 project came out, we sort of very quickly gravitated towards it. And so when Fareed reached out to me and was like, hey, is this something that you all would be interested in? We very quickly connected about that. So Fareed, if you want to click to the next one, yeah. Our approach sort of goes in several different areas. So we focused on professional development for our teachers, on implementation of the 1619 resources within our curriculum. We created some student experiences, and then we've also looked at how we can use this to inform our standard revision. So in terms of professional developments, we have district-wide professional development days for our social studies teachers. And so you see two pictures here of professional development sessions that we hosted with our secondary social studies teachers in the 2019-2020 school year. Our teachers, for a portion of one of their professional development days, split up into grade level cohorts where they were looking at their own curriculum over the course of the day for each of their grade levels. But we started each session with a Paideia seminar discussion of Nicole Hannah-Jones's opening essay from the 1619 project. And that's what you can see in the picture there on the right, where teachers came together to discuss and themselves wrestle with the ideas that are proposed in Nicole's opening essay. Later in the day, we had another session that was co-led by one of our teachers, Adrian Glasgow from Dunbar High School, and also Fareed from Pulitzer Center. And they looked at how they created a session on how teachers could try to start implementing the 1619 project into their own classes. At that stage, it was fairly open-ended. And so we really were trying to get the resources into the hands of our teachers and let them try things out with their students to see what would work and what could be replicated and scaled up. Going along with that, we were able to get 5,000 copies of the 1619 Project magazine, which we distributed to our schools so that a class set was sent to every teacher of an 8th grade US history class, a 9th grade World History 1 class, and an 11th grade US history class. And we, over time, we were able to actually integrate some of the articles directly into this centralized curriculum. We did that in partnership with our teachers who came and worked with us over the summer last year. And so you can see from the list here, these are the specific places where we have explicitly built the essays into our curriculum that is used by teachers in every school in the district. Beyond that, we also wanted to make sure that students were very quickly getting exposed to these resources and taking advantage of some exciting events. So on the right side there, you can see the very top, at the very bottom there, you can see the tops of some heads of some folks that came together. Students came to share the work that they had done implementing and learning about the 1619 Project, and then creating work on their own at an event that was held at the National Museum of African American History and Culture here in Washington, D.C. If you click one more time, Fareed, see one more picture. Yep. We also were lucky enough to have Nicole Hannah-Jones join us for a moderated discussion with students at Dunbar High School, which also has a Black Studies program that was heavily using the project. We had a training there for our social studies content leads that are based in all of our middle and high schools. And then Nicole was kind enough to have an interview with one of our teachers for the benefit of our students. Students at another one of our high schools, Eastern High School, which you see on the left there, were really inspired by the work they've been doing and learning about the 1619 Project in their social studies classes. And so at their leadership, there was an event that they put on to help teach more people in the school and community about what they were learning through the project. The last angle I wanted to share is standards. Oh, yeah, there we go. As in most states, DC has, as in all states, DC has state social studies standards, which lay out what students are meant to learn in every grade level or grade band. Our standards have not been updated since 2006. And so starting in the fall of 2019, shortly after the project came out, our team put together some testimony for the State Board of Education, encouraging them to revise the state standards and in part to try to target the white racial bias that we were seeing in our current standards. If you see the guiding principles snapshot on the left, this document was adopted just a few months ago in December, and it is meant to guide the revision of standards, which is starting this month. Some of the principles embedded in there include revising the standards to include anti-racist framing, recognition of underrepresented groups, and an orientation towards teaching the hard history of slavery and racism. And a lot of these recommendations are based on the work that has been done as a result of the 1619 Project. My contact information, I think, is on this next slide, but I'm happy to answer any questions during the latter part of the session, and I'll pass it off to my colleagues.
Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Rebecca Coven. I'm an English and social studies teacher in Chicago Public Schools at the high school level. And I'll talk a little bit about how we implemented the 1619 at the classroom level. So you can go to the next slide. So one of the goals of our class, this work was done in a humanities class combining English and social studies. And one of the goals of our humanities class is to examine how historical events are really root causes of contemporary social issues that can help us better understand and solve these issues. And so the 1619 Project is a great resource to use for this because it's a great opportunity to examine how the racial hierarchy that was created as a result of the institution of slavery and kind of the anti-Black sentiments, that racism that was cultivated during slavery still impact our social, political, and economic institutions today. But what I also really love about the 1619 Project is it not only talks about this kind of racial hierarchy, but it also examines how Black resistance and Black innovation has contributed to our democracy and to our society. And so it really uplifts and celebrates the contributions of Black people throughout history and today. And I think that's really important because too often in schools, when we teach BIPOC students and specifically Black students, when they see themselves in the curriculum, too often we talk about them as victims of oppression. And so our students don't have any opportunities to see themselves represented in a positive light in the curriculum. And it's equally important to celebrate the contributions of BIPOC to our communities so they can see that positive representation as well. And so I love that the 1619 Project does that. And so if the goal of the 1619 Project is really to look at this lasting legacy of slavery in our country, what I want to do with students is localize it a little bit more and look at how the legacy of slavery impacts social, political, and economic institutions in our communities today. So in Chicago, in Illinois, in their students' neighborhoods, at our school. So you can go to the next slide. So the way we did this, we started by, this was actually an activity based on Pulitzer Center curriculum. They started by creating an alternative timeline of US history, really reframing US history, thinking about 1619 as our nation's birth year, so that we use some companion resources from Learning for Justice, which is formerly Teaching Tolerance, and their Teaching Hard History curriculum to learn about the history of slavery. And from there, we moved on to work with the magazine. And we really honed in on the articles that look at how the legacy of slavery impacts various social, political, and economic institutions in our country today. So that whether that be our criminal justice system, our healthcare system, our infrastructure. And so students learned about that. And then from there, they created their own class-wide magazine called the 1619 Project Sullivan Edition. And so they created a magazine modeled after the 1619 Project that contained stories that showed how they can see the racial inequity described in the article they had read in the previous step. So whether it's about mass incarceration, whether it's about infrastructure, how they could see that inequity in their own communities today. So at our school in Rogers Park, where our school is located in Chicago. And they also thought in their stories what should be done to address this racial inequity. And they also created stories about how resistance, innovation, and advocacy by Black people has contributed to our communities today. So if you could go to the next slide. So their final project, and the link is right there on the screen if you would like to see the full version, but they created a 42-page magazine that was completely researched, written, illustrated, and produced, including visuals, editing, layout, fact-checking, completely done by the 10th grade students. And students shared this work at our first ever Black Lives Matter Day of Action last year. So that Day of Action actually came out of this work. And so I have some examples here of the work that they did. You can see on the left, a student did an illustration of how highways in Chicago have created racial segregation. On the right, there's an article about school-based health centers. We actually have a school-based health center at our school. If you go to the next slide, this is an example of, yes, so this is a student who had learned about mass incarceration, and she actually polled students in our school about their experiences with mass incarceration and interviewed them. If you go to the next slide. Yes, and this is a cartoon that a student did that was really fantastic. It's about, there's two characters in the cartoon. It's a much larger cartoon, one from the south side of Chicago, one from the north side, and their different experiences trying to get help through the healthcare system. And there are tons of other articles in the magazine that really range. There's portraits of the justice system. There's an article on restorative practices at our school to fight the school to prison pipeline. A student wrote a personal narrative about her experience living on the west side of the city versus the north side. There's an article about how our public transportation system has created segregation, and there's an article about redlining. It really ranges. If you could go to the next slide. And so this was really a growing experience for our students, and I wanted to share just a brief quote from the introduction that they wrote to the magazine. And they said, "In the process of creating our own magazine, We were able to see how many of the issues discussed in the 1619 project could be seen in our own communities within the city, neighborhood, or school. Amongst all of these inequalities, we had the opportunities to see the resilience, determination, and courageousness of people of color. Because of the resilience of enslaved Africans, other groups of people who are marginalized today and who have been marginalized throughout history have been given the opportunity to fight back, given hope by the success of others before them. That's just a brief overview of our project, and I'll pass it over to Marissa.
So we'll go to Jason next. Over to you, Jason.
Thank you very much, everyone. My name is Jay Hall. I'm the Acting Director of the BPS Office of Culturally and Linguistically Responsive Initiatives. We were asked the question, why did you connect the 16 project to your students? Quite simply, we did that because we wanted to lead with the truth. It's been far too long that we have not been leading with the truth. We also wanted to emancipate or free our curriculum from decades and decades of Eurocentric influence. The words of Nicole Hannah-Jones, I see my work as forcing us to confront our hypocrisy, forcing us to confront the truth that we would rather ignore, live in our office each day. The words of Congressman John Robert Lewis, to those who have said be patient and wait, we must say that patience is a dirty and nasty word. We have not waited. We have reframed our curriculum in history by placing the consequences of slavery, the contributions of Black Americans from 1619 through the Civil War to Reconstruction, the Civil Rights Movement, and today. Next slide, please. Not only has this brightened the future and brought the joy of learning to our Black students, but I'm proudly here to report to you today that I was asked by our Indigenous families to share the tremendous impact it has had on them as well. Let's look, for instance, at the California Gold Rush. Is the path to truth found on the bookshelves in America's classrooms? Why must we emancipate the curriculum? These are questions inspired by 1619 and the work done here by this team. We're asking ourselves each day. Read the review for this book, Hornspoon, especially the second paragraph, the last line. It does a great but humorous job of showing how a gold rush can affect individuals or a community. It's a fun story. These are books that we have found on our classroom shelves in Buffalo, and I'm guessing that these are the books that are found throughout America in our classrooms, which are purporting to teach the truth about things like the gold rush. Next slide, please. But the path to the truth must contain the truth. And if you look at these photographs, without saying, we know that a genocide took place. So our Indigenous families in Buffalo, which was born and developed on the land of the Haudenosaunee, we thank you for opening up different paths to the truth for our other Black and brown brothers and sisters and families here in Buffalo. Next slide, please. The next question was, how did you engage your students with the project? Through our newly released compendium of over 150 built from scratch by teachers, lessons and experience called the BPS Emancipation Curriculum. The 1619 project has provided us with an invaluable resource as we actively and with a sense of urgency layer text and truth in our curriculum to center joy in learning. What you see here is one portion of our 11 through 12 interactive emancipation curriculum lesson timeline. I'll show you more examples of that in a second, but I pulled out pieces from the cluster of the lesson that we've created for the idea of America. We use the podcast. The article by Nicole Hannah-Jones has been a wonderful anchor text, along with articles such as sugar, medical inequality, mass incarceration, and on and on and on. We have the anchor text now that provide a path to truth for our students and their families. Next slide, please. So what is the BPS Emancipation curriculum? Like I said, it's a series of over 150 lessons and experiences tailored to the historical, linguistic, and ethnic backgrounds of our students. It offers students the opportunity to see themselves positively in the curriculum, and it boosts cognitive emancipation, seeing themselves as people like Imhotep and Mansa Musa and John Lewis. These experiences raise marginalized voices in our district schools, classrooms, and community, with focusing on African Americans, Indigenous peoples, our Latinx families, and new Americans. It's infused into the standing curriculum by skill and content-based standards and alignment, and it's actively working right now to dismantle the school to prison pipeline. Next slide, please. I saw a question come up in the Q&A about resources for younger students and how we link 1619. And what you see here is an example from our 2 through 4 band and our 5 through 6 band. And if I had the PK through 1 band, you would see that we've taken books like All Because You Matter. Remember that name. Remember Henry's Freedom Box, Emancipation of Grandpa Sandy Wells, a vast wealth of children's books that you can use at those lower grades for whomever posted that question to incorporate 1619. These timelines and this curriculum has changed the life of our parents, our students, our teachers, our families, and our community. And we thank you for the opportunity and for the inspiration from this team. Next slide, please. The journey continues here in Buffalo. We would like to thank the Pulitzer Center and the 1619 project team for your inspiration and continuous support. In Buffalo, we say that we are the paradigm shift. We say that we don't play. Enough is enough. It's time to get in good trouble because patience is a dirty, nasty word. Our Associate Superintendent, Dr. Fatima Morel, our fearless leader, would like to say thank you very much, as well as I would like to thank everybody here for the inspiration. And please join us when we welcome Nicole Hannah-Jones to our Urban Forum Conference on March 16th, 2021. Thank you for having me. It's an honor to share the courageous work that we're doing here in Buffalo.
Hi, everyone. My name is Marissa Long, and I am a middle school teacher. I currently teach 8th grade U.S. history and current events in Beverly Hills Unified School District. And this is our first dedicated middle school in Beverly Hills and only our second year with BVMS. And I'm going to tell you guys how I and my team of colleagues built and implemented a 1619 project, versions of it, using it as a supplement for our Colonial America unit. Just like my colleagues, we're going to start with why connect this with students. I teach middle school, and middle school history is US history in 8th grade. And I remember being an 8th grader myself and not knowing the truth because we weren't told the truth. I really approach my craft, my job as a story, and I'm the storyteller. So it is my responsibility to tell them the entire truth. Waiting till high school is too late. This was also a very interesting year in Los Angeles and throughout the nation with lots of civil unrest, lots of protest, even in the city of Beverly Hills, marching through the city for the very first time. My student body saw what protecting the domestic tranquility of a country looks like, and what it looks like when you have sort of this intersection of First Amendment rights with a Black Lives Matter protest meeting a pro-Trump rally. The pictures that you guys see in front of you and the tweet are all from the city of Beverly Hills. They were all taken over the course of the summer. And as I watched these events unfold, and also sitting in a pandemic and wondering, am I going to go back to school with my students? Am I going to see them face to face? How am I going to tackle this? How am I going to contextualize this for my students? Because that's what history is all about. There's no point in talking about the past if you can't connect it to the present. One of my favorite photographers, Robert Frank, also said, his photos always captured the humanity of the moment. And that's what I really wanted to capitalize on, the humanity of the moment that my students were currently engaged in for the very first time. One of the things that I do, because I am a middle school teacher, 8th grade is about building a deeper foundation for American history. So in preparing my students to talk about not only the 1619 project, but other current events that I would bring into class. And just like my colleagues have said, you have to talk about politics. This is also an election year. What unfortunately happened was the week before my colleagues and I started this lesson, Donald Trump tweeted that the 1619 project was indoctrination. And before we even started, we were already getting emails from parents wondering about the curriculum. One of the ways that I like to foster my classroom environment is through openness and safety. And I wanted to give them a safe space to have conversations, to ask questions with a trusted adult, with someone that was going to come from a place of no judgment. What you guys see in front of you is also one of the activities I do with my students. It's called Perspectical Spectacles. We all make these paper glasses, and it's a way for us to understand that the conversations we have, the people that we have them with, they all come with their own unique lenses in which they view the world. And our job is to listen to understand, not always to listen to respond. So anytime something would happen that would bring about a lot of different opinions or debate, I would always say, okay, put on your perspectical spectacles. Let's try to see this from a different point of view. And it's a really fun activity. Obviously, we all look super cool. And part of the beauty is that the kids all, they're comfortable because they all look the same for one moment. And I guess really as a middle school teacher, as the only middle school teacher on the panel, I know that in California, they're not going to get US history again until they're juniors in high school. It's too late. Waiting until high school is too late. The middle school is an appropriate place to bring in these kinds of conversation with the full truth, not the half truths. I remember reading the book when I was in graduate school, and much too late, but in graduate school, lies my history teacher told me. And I was not going to be one of those history teachers. I was going to tell them as much as I could within the context of our standards. So next slide, Fareed. This is how I did it. Everyone has their own take on how they use the material, as my team and I did. We all came together to brainstorm with the help of my very supportive principal, Kevin Allen. What are we going to anchor this on? Well, first we have to build a foundation, and that's what we do. Since our first unit is colonial America, I really felt it important to start the dialogue early. So we started the conversation in September, and it culminated with a research project that came to an end in October. So these are some of the foundations, some of the hooks that we used, and ultimately everything was anchored through our essential questions. They were exposed to these 5 essential questions before they actually began the research, before we actually began diving deeper into colonial America and the institution of slavery and its effects and repercussions and how it connects to what's happening now. But these essential questions, they saw ahead of time, like I said, and they would have to answer one by the end of our exploration. You can go to the next slide, Fareed. One of the first things I did after we did some background is we started with more foundation and a different kind of a background. I had polled my students and given them a learning modality quiz before we started this unit as part of my getting to know them. And I found that at least 1/3 of my students reported being auditory learners. So I loved the podcast. The podcast is beautiful. The podcast I'm a big fan of. I've listened to all episodes, but really only one episode hits 8th grade standards. So I decided to use episode 1 along with a guided digital notebook where we would stop after listening to a little bit of the podcast to analyze some of the sources that we were listening to, some of the feedback we were listening to. And this is also an early way to teach evidence analysis. They didn't quite know that they were analyzing it because of the way it was broken up. We had a quote, a direct quote from the podcast, What does it mean to you and why does it matter? So after every small piece of podcast, we did not listen to it in one day. 45 minutes sounds like an amazing podcast to me, but for 8th graders, I'm going to lose them. So we broke this up over the course of 2 days. Ultimately, it's their task was to now do a research project where we were not only going to look at the institution of slavery, but also the context in which the 1619 project has been debated in this country. And that was one of the most fascinating things, to bring in literally what was happening within the last couple of weeks. And my colleague, my brilliant colleague, Zach Safi, if you can go to the next slide, Fareed, he built out a Google Sites that had a ton of amazing resources that the history department used as their anchor research site. All of these articles were tailored, handpicked. All of them showed both sides of the coin because we were talking about perspective. So part of the questions were, well, what is a creator's perspective? Why does she think that we should be talking about this in school? And what is the other perspective? Why do they not think that we should be talking about it in school? And we also dove into bigger concepts that I knew for a lot of kids they were being exposed to for the very first time. So we also needed to go slowly, and a lot of handholding and explanation was involved. We talked about things like mass incarceration, like my colleague Rebecca. We talked about the idea of systemic racism. Does it exist? Does it not exist? And finally, what kind of America do you see? Now that you have all of this new perspective, what's your opinion on it? And these were some of the projects that I lifted some examples for you guys from. My students got to pick who they wanted to work with, and they all had my guidance the entire time. I was hopping in and out of breakout rooms for 3 weeks straight, answering questions for students, while all at the same time working with my principal to sort of try to get some parents that were really upset to sort of see this project in its entirety. It was a really valuable experience, but I think the most rewarding part is what you guys are going to see on the next slide, the reflections from my students. I took a risk. My team took a risk doing this in such a highly charged political climate. And as you saw from some of the pictures before, Beverly Hills was the epicenter of a Donald Trump rally almost every Saturday. My kids couldn't ignore it. They couldn't get away from it. I really wanted to know how they felt about this entire experience as we dived in and as things unfolded. Almost by the day, every time they went to the website, it was updated with something new. And you can see overwhelmingly, the response was positive. It wasn't all positive from everybody, but that's okay. We started a really important conversation. And the things that they shared with me, they shared because they felt safe sharing those things. My favorite reflection is the one that I put an arrow to. This student says, I honestly thought it was great hearing the podcast and writing our own opinions on such a large and important topic like slavery and racism. It was fun working with my partners who had the same views as me and writing our own and forming our own opinions on racism. As a 13-year-old, we don't get to use our opinions like adults can, like voting and other things like that. But with this project, we can get to express what we thought about the country in our own way and learn the ideas, learn the good and the bad of this country, and actually learn about social inequality and see what BLM protesters are fighting for instead of just hearing about it on the news. That was all I needed to hear to know that I was doing exactly the right thing. This bottom reflection as well, it just made me dive into the history of slavery in America a lot further and got me thinking a lot about the topic and other perspectives on 1619. Basically, it pushed me into a dark room with a match and I came out with a flashlight. And that is why, regardless of the experience that I had, that I will speak to later, I won't stop doing this. Just like my colleague before me said, sometimes it's okay to get into some good trouble. And I definitely got into some good trouble because of the work that we did, but I don't regret it for a second. Passing it on to my next colleague.
Thank you, Marissa. It's a pleasure to be with you tonight to talk about a work that I'm so passionate about. Studying the 1619 Project really was groundbreaking work and an awesome experience for our students, our families, and our entire community. I have the honor and pleasure to serve at the school district of University City under the leadership of Dr. Sharonica Hardin-Bartley. And the principal of the high school, Mr. Michael Peoples, both of those leaders worked together to support me, my work as an English teacher, trying to have my students work through the 1619 Project. And I stress English teacher because you would think that this would naturally be a good fit for social studies. But what I'm going to talk to you about is how we took this work and created a deeper learning experience for students that was cross-curricular, that was an example of project-based learning that really focused on engaging students and building skill in the process of it. So when we really talk about how to hit the standards, and I think that that is for all of those educators out there saying, how can I do this without the government really getting upset, DESE getting upset, parents getting upset? We have to make sure that we're still addressing the standards. So I made sure that all of the necessary standards from Common Core, the historical thinking standards, even the NCSS and C3 standards for social studies were hit throughout this work. And I really tried to keep the essential questions as broad as possible because I wanted to make sure that the students were constructing meaning as much as possible. And I didn't want to lead them down any particular path. I wanted them to be able to walk away with whatever landed in close to home for them. And when we just look at these questions, who writes history? When I tell you how much time we spent just on that question, because the answers, those who have power, those who have money, white men, the answers that they started coming up with started leading to other questions and other questions. How do we determine what is true? Well, that's a good question. How do we determine it? And they started thinking about it. Well, is it historians? Is it religious leaders? Is it the elders? Like, who determines what's true and how is that passed down from generation to generation? And then what is the relationship between truth and reconciliation? And if we really think about the heart of this work and why I'm so passionate about it, we have never reconciled from the trauma, from the pain of the system of slavery that was the foundation of this country. We've never dealt with it. And even now you're seeing in the news how discussion about it is trying to be squelched at every turn. And we are being combated just for trying to teach content and trying to engage students in this learning. So as we go to the next slide, I really want it to be clear that the students owned this project. And this is actually a slide that my students created. Because what they did when Tom Cotton tried to introduce legislation to prevent the teaching of this work, and Donald Trump came out with a statement bashing the 1619 Project, my students were like, oh no, he's not. We have to make sure that this can be taught because it was so enriching for them. They were so passionate about it that they created a presentation and presented to our Board of Education to make sure that they could still learn from this, and they advocated for it being introduced at younger ages. So I have here what my student kind of listed as kind of like our journey through studying the 1619 Project. And when I thought about how to unpack this work for them, I really thought it to be most important to connect the what with the why. And many times we put content before our students. We have them reading essays and everything, but why? Like, what are they supposed to take away from it? What are they supposed to do with it? So I started with content that was closest to them. And we started with Nicole Hannah-Jones' podcast, The Problem We All Live With, because we live by Normandy school system. I actually graduated from Francis Howell High School. So when we start talking about school segregation, we're in a segregated school. Let's talk about that. And I made sure to unpack this work in a way that really hit close to them, and I allowed them to drive the process. Next slide, please. So what my students really felt was the most impactful part of this. And I'm not going into everything because I have had the pleasure and privilege of speaking before. So if you look at previous webinars, excuse me, you can kind of see more details about the work that we did, and it was more extensive. I wanted to go in depth talking about what they walked away with as being life-changing experiences and conversations. And it really centered around what has changed over all of this time, and why are people saying that this is not true when there is evidence of every single thing that we are dealing with as a challenge within our country and within our society, and it having a direct connection to the legacy of slavery. And the one that they really talked about was the healthcare system. So when we just talked about like the roots of the healthcare system and how some have access to quality healthcare system, some have protection in the healthcare system, and some don't. And so we read about Dr. Sims, the father of modern gynecology. And I had the students just ask the question, who gets protected in the system and who doesn't? And this was connected to episode 4 in the podcast and the article about how the bad blood starts. And when we started talking about Black bodies and the value of life, and started thinking about all of the experiments that had been inflicted upon Black bodies and how enslaved people were used, specifically enslaved women, were used as cadavers. Next slide. How they were experimented upon, not even being given any anesthetic, any type of care or concern, because they weren't considered human. And because they actually thought that Black people had a higher pain tolerance than white people, than other people. So we don't need to worry about them. They don't feel pain. We can do anything. And my students were reading this and they were listening to the podcast that talked about after the Emancipation and how the former enslaved people were just set free with no health care, no type of shelter, no clothes, no protection, and how heaps of bodies amassed along the roads, and how the white communities fought to keep the people out for fear of syphilis spreading and different diseases spreading. And then they compared that to what happened throughout history, where Black people were experimented upon or Black people were denied healthcare, even today when we talk about COVID-19, and how it has disproportionately impacted Black and brown communities. And even right now, who's getting vaccinated and who is not? Who has true access and who does not? So I had a conversation with students even today where they are planning a project connected to how do we get the word out there that this really is a problem, and it's a problem that is directly connected to the system of slavery that we have never dealt with, that we've never really truly uncovered to the point where we're actually going to do something about it. Next slide. So my students wrote so many reflections, and they were 11th and 12th graders, so they wrote so much, and I'm just going to share with you just one snippet. The student said, at the same time, conflicting beliefs over the strength of African Americans were seen as accepted medical knowledge. As noted in the text, Living While Black Killed My Mom by Damon Young, James Marion Sims, regarded as the father of modern gynecology, used Black women as test subjects because of the belief that they possessed a supernatural tolerance for pain. In his brutal experimentation, Sims was successful in finding a cure, but the belief that Blacks were stronger goes against the ideology expressed as a result of their high death rates. So on one hand, you have whites arguing that Blacks were too weak to live without the whip and that they needed white masters to be able to live and survive and thrive. But on the other hand, they believed their tolerance for environment and for pain was that above whites. This seemingly contradictory viewpoint still holds true to an extent in modern times. And they walked away just feeling like it's hypocrisy at its finest, and it's staring us in our face every single day. Next slide. So when they talked about the criticism and they presented before the board, this is another slide that they created. You can go to the next slide. One of the biggest things that they wanted to do was advocate for just the topic of race to be introduced into school at earlier ages. And they really stressed the fact that this will never change until classmates are forced to interact with and have hard conversations around hard truths and hard history with classmates that don't look like them, learning about families that don't live the way that they live and don't have the same experiences as them. And if we don't do that, racial ignorance and bias will never decrease. It'll never go away. And we have to start using resources like the 1619 Project to combat the whitewashed history, the omission, the erasure of the experiences, the lived and shared experiences of Black and Brown people within this country. So they wrote poetry, they created an entire museum space. We commandeered this space to be able to curate our learning, because they even wanted to share their learning with teachers within our building who did not agree with the teaching of the 1619 Project. And one of the reasons an English teacher taught it was because the social studies teachers wouldn't. And we hadn't gotten to the place then where we were doing it district-wide, but that is our plan for next year. So when we're talking about all of this, I just appreciate the opportunity to share my knowledge, expertise, and my passion for this work.
Hi. Oh. Okay, great. Oh, thank you so much. I mean, these presentations were amazing. I cannot believe how hard you all have worked on the curriculum. I'm blown away because you're all doing something different. And yet one of the things that I believe that the 1619 Project has done, other than helped us rethink the way this country was founded, it has introduced, like, the days of multiple choice and reading the text, that's over. Our students are now learning how to analyze for themselves and decide who is writing history. And so with that, I think we have to address the elephant in this virtual room with all the hundreds of us that are in here. How do you handle the pushback that is happening right now? It includes Iowa, which is Nicole Hannah-Jones's home state. We talk about that often. And I know some of you come from more liberal districts. So I would like for Marissa and for Christina to address this question, because I know you all have experienced some pushback. So please share how to navigate the pushback.
Yeah, so I teach in Beverly Hills, and it is a very affluent community, but it's also evolving. And when I would say when I started 8 years ago, it was very conservative, and I've seen a lot of change. My colleagues and I, we touched on the 1619 Project last year with not one piece of negative feedback in general. This year was quite a different story. Like I said earlier, Donald Trump had tweeted that the 1619 Project was indoctrination 1 week before I started it. A small group of parents essentially went to me first, complained that they didn't want me to do this, then went to my principal, complained to him, didn't get what they wanted from him. So they upped the ante and circulated a petition to get me fired and stop the teaching of the 1619 Project in our district. And that had an unintended effect because people came out of the woodwork writing letters of support to the school board, writing letters of support to me because I was called out personally. I was the villain and my principal was my co-conspirator. And we had this master plan of, ruining American history, but really we knew that that wasn't the truth. And we knew that if people actually looked at what we were doing, they were wrong. But they hadn't before they made these accusations. I was supported at all levels of our district, from my principal all the way to my superintendent, who at a board meeting made a very public statement, basically denouncing what was going on and telling parents that if you don't have a social studies credential, you don't get to decide what happens in social studies classrooms. This was really hard for me to deal with because up to this point in my teaching career, I had gotten nothing but praise, awards, positive feedback, nay, a negative review, nothing. So I had to realize though that this would not have been happening if all of these other real world events weren't also unfolding on top of my curriculum. And talk about the humanity of the moment. I went from a range of emotions, from being super cavalier about it, not a big deal, to, oh my gosh, what's going on? These people are crazy, to, am I actually going to get fired, to enraged, and also lit up to continue to keep going because I knew it was the right thing to do. So anyone that gets pushback from this, my advice to you would be ready to connect everything back to the standards, because that's what I did. Everything always went back to the standards. So there's no reason that I can't also use this as a supplement. And I also got very fortunate that I had such an supportive administration and superintendent and colleagues who knew that this was a one-off, a weird isolated incident, and it was something happening because the year 2020 was a dumpster fire. And I hope that none of you hear my story and hear my experience and are afraid to try, because I really felt it was important to start introducing this at a younger age and to respond to everything that these students were experiencing in the summer before I got to them. So don't give up, keep it up. All of us here are here to help you and share resources. I will give you anything you want. We don't need to recreate the wheel. We can just use each other's amazing work and make this really a national movement at a grassroots level.
Thank you. Christina, if you could just quickly address, because I know you had issues in your district with, you talked about how the social studies teachers didn't want to do it. So can you talk about how you navigated that and what you're going to do going forward?
Yes. So I am from Missouri, which is one of the 5 states where senators have introduced legislation to punish school systems that teach the 1619 Project. So we have pressure coming from the state level, and then within the actual school, we have some people who don't believe that it is historically accurate. Everything that the 1619 Project says is not being accepted by historians. And so the biggest thing that I say is we need to consider this a text, and we put text, high quality, rich, powerful text in front of our students every single day, whether it's a novel, a short story, or whatever. So what I say is no matter who disagrees with what the 1619 Project says, they shouldn't disagree with your approach, because you're going to teach students to interrogate the text just like you would if it was Of Mice and Men or if it was The Jungle. No matter what it is you're putting in front of them, you teach them to question, to write about it, to think deeply and critically about it. So when naysayers try to come for me or for my practice, there's nothing they can say, because I make sure that I approach it with objectivity, with making sure all of the standards and all of the skills that are supposed to be covered are the focus, and making sure that the student-centered approach is what is driving every action that I take. And so because of that, I have had support, and that's what I advise anybody else who's interested in this work. This is a text, a rich, powerful, beautiful text that is incorporating so many different types of literature. You have the audios, the images, the poetry, the essays. And when you think about having students read that, it is our responsibility as English teachers, social studies teachers, especially the literacy-based content areas. It's our job to teach kids to read anything and everything. So we shouldn't lose sight of that. And we allow people to get caught up on the content, and we need to, refer them back to our underlying goal as educators, to build our students' skill and their foundational knowledge. And if that just happens to be with the 1619 project, then they're growing as people in the process of that also.
Thank you. Thank you. Another question of many of the folks who are out there watching, they want to get some guidance on how to reach students who might not read at a level that they should be reading at, or how can you bring this to younger students? And so maybe we'll start with Rebecca, because you're in middle school, I think. And then if we could also hear from Scott. Thank you.
Yeah, so thanks, Nikita. I'd love to speak to this. I teach at the high school level, but almost the majority of my students come to me reading below grade level. So that's certainly a challenge that I faced. But one of the strengths of the 1619 project, and what I love about it, is that it's a multitude of mediums, right? It's not just written text. We used a lot of the poetry in the 1619 project to help students engage with the texts. We used a lot of the images, the photos as well, and paired it with excerpts from some of the text. I do wish there were some leveled versions of the text for my students. Having the podcast really helped as well. So when we read The Idea of America by Nicole Hannah-Jones, we listened to the podcast as well for different types of learners. But I think also there are a ton of resources out there that you can use as partner texts with the 1619 project to help your students access this content. So I mentioned earlier, Teaching Hard History from Learning for Justice is incredibly useful. Excerpts from The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander is incredibly useful as well. But what I really want to encourage you is, just because the texts are more challenging doesn't mean the students can't access the concepts. And students at any level, you saw Marissa did this with her students at the middle school level, my students at the high school level, who are reading probably a little bit below a middle school level, we're also able to access it and have really high level discussions about these concepts, regardless of their reading level.
I can add in a little bit. I would agree with everything Rebecca said. Great ideas. Certainly in DC, we have a lot of schools where there are struggling readers. And I would say one of the big things I've heard from our high school teachers in particular is that the podcasts have really resonated with our students. Beyond that, just elaborating a little bit on the instructional moves that teachers can use. We do a lot of close reading of complex texts in DC. And so that might involve the close reading several times of an article, and then having an opportunity to discuss it. So starting with a shared read by the teacher, and then having students go back and define vocabulary, and then really start to unpack the ideas through things like Paideia Seminar or Socratic Seminar. have been useful tools to break down the complexity of the ideas in the text. And then one other, there was one question that came up about, could you use this with elementary students? We are looking at doing that going forward into next year. And we've been looking at things by Sam Weinberg. He's written this article called Tampering with History, which is about how you might modify primary source documents or other texts in certain ways and in thoughtful ways to try to make them accessible. So I'll drop a link in the chat for that article if you want to check that out.
Thank you. I think our final question tonight will go to Jay. I know other folks in the chat have been asking about, how do you reach non-Black students, particularly white students who might be in a cycle of generational poverty? How do they feel about this curriculum? So Jay, if you could address how you have approached this and how your students have responded.
Absolutely. Thank you for the question. When we set out to develop the Emancipation curriculum, we definitely had that in mind. Our superintendent, Dr. Kreiner Cash, was very adamant about that as well. And we do that through likenesses. Our students need to be able to see themselves in their text, in their schools, in their teachers. And they can see themselves in their teachers or other students when we find things that we have in common, similar struggles, similar loves, similar likenesses, similar passions. And that takes conversating and using things like restorative practices and circling up and talking and establishing dialogues. When we work with white students, primarily, who say, I want to support this curriculum, but I'm Caucasian, so I will never know what it feels like. I will never fully understand it. We know that. So we've started a program using the 7 archetypes of allyism. And I think this is a great idea for people looking for more buy-in from Caucasian teachers or giving white students something to buy in. So we look at being a sponsor ally, a champion ally, an amplifier ally, an advocate, a scholar, an upstander, or a confidant. And that offers 7 ins for our students to become allies. And it's been an amazing process so far. We've actually spread this, it's the work of Karen Gatlin, I believe her name is, and it's slowly growing, and I'm using it in organizations in Buffalo as well. But I think it's time that we let people know, especially Caucasian people in America, that there's more than one way to become an ally and to support this work. You don't have to go out there with a microphone. Being a confidant, you don't need that recognition. You do that work very quietly. So we have a lot of students doing quiet work, a lot of students doing louder work, and there are Caucasian students. And we have built in struggles and linked to books in the curriculum that show the linkage between people and struggles over time, so that we know that we do have certain things in common in our country. So we're doing a lot of work in that area right now, and we continue, and it is a challenge. So we continue to research in that area, and we hope that we can keep this going, and we know we're doing it the right way. So we're seeing great results so far with that approach.
Thank you so much. I want to thank the panelists tonight. I want to thank the Pulitzer Center, and I want to thank my employer, the New York Times, for taking on this project and giving us the resources. When I started researching my essay, I turned to many sources, but I definitely looked at the Southern Poverty Law Center, and immediately learned that 60% of teachers out there didn't think that their textbooks were cutting it, and most of the most popular textbooks were getting failing grades. So here we are trying to figure it out, and you guys are doing a great job. Thank you very much. I guess I'll have Fareed, send us off, and I hope you'll participate in more webinars.
Thank you, Nikita. Thank you, panelists. Thank you all. Please continue the conversation with us by reaching out to 1619 at pulitzercenter.org or education@pulitzercenter.org. You'll also be receiving the recording and the slides, which include some of the resources, contact information from our panelists. But this is a really generous group, and I'm sure if you have questions for them, please direct them our way. We will connect you. We're lucky that all of you on the call and panelists, all of you here, that our communities have you all working with them. Thank you so much for all that you do. And we hope to see you all at next Thursday's event with the American Federation of Teachers and Nicole Hannah-Jones, and to collaborate in the future. Thank you all so much. And I'll go ahead and end the call now so that you'll see a survey pop up where we can get some of your feedback. Again, Nikita, panelists, thank you for your time. I know I'm leaving and can't stop smiling. So learning a lot, thinking a lot. So thank you all. Feel free to unmute if you want to say thank you. Goodbye.
Good night.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Pulitzer. Thank you, New York Times.
Thank you. Bye-bye.